Welcome to This Jungian Life. Three good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marciano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marciano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod. Today, we are going to talk about a highly polarized and very hot topic that is up in the culture everywhere, and that is abortion. It is certainly hard to talk about when the public bullhorns seem to really drown out or preclude discussion. We seem to have reached, as a collective, kind of a polarized, heated stalemate. There's a lot of exhaustion, the use of extreme examples and stories on the media that are intended to elicit a really strong emotional response. And all this interferes with our ability to talk about difficult topics and topics that matter. So part of our intention on the podcast is the topic itself and how can we talk about it, and that we should. This topic tests our ability to tolerate ambiguity, and ambiguity always raises anxiety and emotion. So we want to consider abortion. We want to explore its collective and personal significance and understand both sides better. And we don't want to veer into being one-sided, moralistic, legalistic, or over-emotional. We want to try to talk about it, and it is eminently worthy of public discussion. So we'd like to invite you to step out of fixed positions, and that includes us, certainty, and be open to multiple realities, complexity, and ambivalence. I think the image that will serve us is the image of yin and yang. They are different and opposed, and together make up for a balanced and whole and lively interactive dynamic.
I think, Deb, thank you so much for that introduction. And I think the first thing that I want to pick up on from it is your use of the word consider, which is a really interesting word because it sort of translates literally from the Latin as with the stars. And so, it means to observe, to think about, and probably originally comes from this idea of studying the stars. So that this could be something that we sift over carefully and that we consider in the largest, most cosmic, if you will, frame as a way of moving beyond these fixed polarities.
Well, if we were to launch from that cosmic perspective and then perhaps work down to the granular experience, we might say that the question around abortion has something to do with the archetype of potential versus the archetype of limits. That on every realm of human existence, a potential brings an enormous amount of excitement and fear, and it makes a demand upon those who are going to carry that potential, carry it to a conclusion. And that, of course, is playing out in the life of the fetus or the pregnancy. And that's polarized against the archetype of limits and all kinds of limits. So, for instance, we might discover that we have a potential to pursue a particular kind of career, but the limits of our lives simply are too severe in order to bring that potential into a manifestation. It remains liminal. It remains an internal and a spiritual and symbolic potential. So I think we navigate the archetype, the very lofty idea of the potential, standing against the limits all the time. In fact, I think we often move through that world even elegantly. But when it comes down to something like an unwanted pregnancy, all of a sudden, it doesn't seem so much like an abstract conversation, although it does have a component of that in it.
Joseph, I appreciate you framing it as potential and limitation. I have a lot of people who are highly intuitive in my practice, and one of the things that intuitives often face is that they have too many ideas. So working with someone, for example, who maybe is a writer and just has idea after idea after idea for a story and feels a certain tension around that because he won't be able to write all of these stories. There's just too many. So there's this sense of, to what potential do we give our allegiance? In what potential do we invest? And the very painful recognition that there will be some potentials left unfulfilled.
Yes.
I remember, I think the first time I ever saw Jim Hollis speak, years and years and years ago, he said, I can't even remember what the topic was, but he said this thing, I can still hear him saying it because it just kind of stopped me in my tracks. He said, "We all murder our children every day."
Oh, I remember that.
You do.
It was a riveting moment
That's so cool. It's so
about
validating.
our limitations. We cannot be, just pure, good, positive, insightful, caring mothers all the time.
Right. And so, I really thought about, what did he mean by that? And, it's like sometimes you have a young, tender part of yourself that you really should be caring for that you don't.
Yes.
And sometimes it's a little bit more like the example I was just giving, where you have a froth of ideas and you have to sacrifice some of them. You have to leave some of them out to die of exposure, because otherwise none of them would be brought forward. You'd be too scattered.
And what this brings up for me, Lisa, is we have to sometimes choose our regret. Which idea are we going to bring forward? And which idea do we have to set aside and leave it out to wither and never come to fruition?
I think that's great. And I want to say, I think we always have to choose our regret.
Yes. And so perhaps what we're really talking about here is whether we choose our regret consciously or not. And I'm thinking about all the things, at least I did as a young mother, where I ignored my children, or I didn't pick up on something, or I was impulsive. And rather than choosing it, I was reactive. And so choosing the regret, I'll use your example, if you're a writer, of which idea to bring forward and which to allow to wither and waste. Is it a conscious choice?
I think that's so important, Deb. And I think about how the efforts to which we as humans will forestall the mourning of the loss of a fantasy by constantly feeding a potential that is not viable. And we've all seen in our practices people that are living in a kind of half-life. They're relating to all of these fantastical potentials because mourning is so intolerable.
Yeah.
And so just as you said, we choose our regrets. And another way of saying that is we choose what we will mourn. Mm-hmm. And this is such a big part of midlife, of course, that we start to realize our mortality. We start to realize that we are not limitless. Life is not limitless. Our resources, internal and external, are not limitless. And there will be many things that we could not bring forward or bring to ripeness in a given life. And so we have to select. And our ability to make a selection, to make a choice, is also intrinsically human. And someone might say that the more choice that we have as human beings, the more human we are. And I mean that in all realms, not to be provocative. For instance, A cheetah can only run like a cheetah. A human being could run like a human being, but they could also decide they're going to run sideways or run in circles or do some kind of strange dance
I'm thinking about that Monty Python sketch, Walk This Way.
Walk this way. And it seems so ubiquitous, but it's rather remarkable that creatures who live purely by instinct don't have choices in the way that humans have many, many choices. So again, we might say that discovering we have a choice and making a choice extends our own understanding and capacity as human beings.
You know, you have just provided a great segue into Jung and what he says about choices, which he calls the ethical problem, which it is. And here's what he says. The ethical problem is affected only to the extent that we become somewhat uncertain about moral evaluations. Nevertheless, we have to make ethical decisions. The relativity of quote good and quote evil by no means signifies that these categories are invalid or do not exist. Moral judgment is always present and carries with it characteristic psychological consequences. Moral evaluation is always founded upon apparent certitudes of moral code, which pretends to know precisely what is good and what is evil. But then he says the foundation is an ethical decision becomes a subjective creative act, which builds on your idea of choice, Joseph. And Jung goes on to say, nothing can spare us the torment of ethical decision. In other words, we must not succumb to either of the opposites, which in pre-psychology days was known as and came under the heading of conflict of duties. So we're all about choice and decision and consciousness and the subjective quality, according to Jung, of an ethical decision and the tension of the opposites. So we have more to discuss.
I think that's such an interesting frame, again, to put forward in a universal way. So as we introspect, as we discover, whether we discover we're pregnant, for instance, in our conversation, or we discover that we have all kinds of other potentials, what is the criteria by which we weigh, the costs of bringing the potential forward versus the impacts, limits,
yes,
and other considerations, and that there is a kind of philosophic or ethical discussion that happens into that, which brings in a kind of thinking cover to it, in addition to the very practical and earthly considerations. Do I have enough money, time, resources, support, all the other things that we need to make something real?
In a way, I think you might be pointing to when you said the criteria by which we make the decision, or Jung's point about it being a subjective process. Do we care? Does it matter in the context of abortion? Or is it a radical, somehow uncaring or dismissive process versus did we really weigh it and what were the criteria that we used to come to what the research says is always a difficult, well-considered, painful decision on the part of the woman. And this, by the way, was, I'm citing something called the Turnaway Study, and I can put that in the show notes, where 1,000 women were interviewed over 5 years, every 6 months, did not regret their decision, and had come to it thoughtfully using personal criteria, but they cared.
There's nothing cavalier about a decision of that magnitude, not at all.
Exactly.
I think that there's something about complexity here. And, part of my interest in talking about this today is, wanting to talk about abortion, but also wanting to talk about how we talk about a topic like this. Because I've been dismayed to see, postings on social media, which is sort of the last place to look for rational discourse, but People saying things like the Republicans are a death cult. I think that kind of inflammatory language, and we can come back to why these issues become so inflamed. I read that and I found myself thinking, that's not going to get us very far down the road in trying to make progress on a policy issue, let's say. What comes up for me is this very Jungian idea about the tension of the opposites that we've talked about before on the podcast. And the thinking is that there are two different positions. There's a pair of opposites, and this can be with anything in life. And that, as the quote that Deb read a minute ago, if you collapse into one polarity, then you're stuck and there can be no movement. But if you can hold both realities at the same time, if you can move back and forth between them and tolerate the kind of unbearable tension that there might be two things that are opposed to one another that are both true, then the possibility exists that the transcendent function will spontaneously generate, presenting us with a new solution that we couldn't have foreseen before. So, one of the polarities, one of the pairs of opposites is that this is a life that's being destroyed when there's an abortion. There's some being, there's some creature. I'm not a legal scholar. I'm not going to try to wade into that waters, but that, you're killing something, I suppose it's the right way to put it. I'm not trying to be incendiary. I have a very close friend. We've been friends for decades, and she is a physician and an abortion provider, and feels, strongly that the work she does in that area is important. And she's told me in detail about what's involved, and it's horrifying. It's horrifying to me to listen to it. It's horrifying to her to do it. She talks about how difficult it is for all of the staff, that this is, we can't gloss this over and pretend like it's inconsequential. It's not.
Yeah.
And on the other side, the other thing that exists on the other polarity is that there are probably as many reasons to have an abortion as there are women who've had an abortion. There are difficult personal circumstances. There's health reasons. There's, that the fetus may have a terrible malformation. There's all kinds of reasons why one would choose to do this. And the importance, as I think we were getting at a minute ago, that the individual has the ability to make the choice that feels right for her. So we're really in the realm of what Jung talks about as the insoluble dilemma, I think. And I think that we make a mistake if we go too hard and too fast to either position and just stay there without acknowledging that there is an argument on the other side.
Two things based on what you just said, Lisa. One is the element of feeling and affect that this friend of yours and other people feel and care about having to perform an abortion. That it really matters. It strikes at the heart of something that has the potential to be alive. Of course it does. And it also raises for me, what are the reasons that a woman would make this choice? And based on my reading and looking over lots of different material this week, women make the decision to have an abortion because they lack the resources. Financial resources, family support resources, personal resources, health resources to raise a child. And in a significant number of cases, it's another child. These are not all done out of wedlock. And now I'm going to segue into a piece of history that's difficult to really acknowledge, which is that not that long ago, what was practiced by families who could not raise a child was infanticide. And this was not a rare occurrence by any means. An anthropologist named Sarah Hurdy, who has written a new book that will be in the show notes. The new book is Mother Nature, Maternal Instincts and How They Shape This Human Species. Sarah Hrdy is a professor emerita at the University of California in Davis. And here's what she says about infanticide. Centuries later, she's talking about 15th century, foundling homes were established to prevent abandoned children from dying. The Hospital of the Innocents in Florence was completed in 1445, and 90 foundlings were left there during the first year. By 1539, 960 babies were left. Eventually, 5,000 infants a year poured in. It was still going 3 centuries later, but of the 15,000 babies left between 1755 and 1773, less than 20 years, 2/3 died before their first birthday. Elsewhere in Europe, it was the same. Of the 72,000 infants abandoned to foundling homes in Sicily between 1783 and 1809, fewer than 30% survived. So I think I just want to highlight in this particularly vivid way what we started out with that you raised, Joseph, which is about limitations and the resources it took then and takes now to raise a child, versus the exigencies of reality and limitation.
If I can just build on that with another example, this is an example that's cited by our colleague Daniela Seif in her article on the death mother. It's an example that was gathered by the anthropologist Marjorie Shostak, and she was working with I'm not going to be able to pronounce it, so I'm going to use the inappropriate term Bushman woman, Nisa. And one of Nisa's earliest memories was on being with a gathering trip with her mother when her mother gave birth to an infant boy. And this is how Nisa described the experience. After he was born, he lay there crying. I greeted him. Ho, ho, my baby brother. Ho, ho, I have a little brother. I'm getting emotional. Someday we'll play together. But my mother said, what do you think this thing is? Why are you talking to it like that? Now get up and go back to the village and bring me my digging stick. I said, what are you going to dig? She said, a hole. I'm going to dig a hole so I can bury the baby. Then you, Nisa, will be able to nurse again. You're much too thin. So Nisa recalls begging her mother not to kill the infant, and the baby was allowed to live. But this is what women have done.
And have had to do. That's such an important point, is have had to do. And it is emotional. There is, as the title of that book suggests, Defenders of the Unborn. We all want to protect a vulnerable, innocent, helpless, potential being to have a fulfilled life.
Yeah, I mean, I think the historical examples, and even coming up with an example, I mean, it seems like from the data that this is sort of a part of the human experience, an ugly, awful, terrible, sad part of the human experience. But it points to there being a sort of archetypal foundation to this.
It's difficult to apply the larger scope of the survival of the existing offspring, the survival of the tribe, even the survival of the parents. In many of the animal cultures where there is a strict hierarchy, that the alpha male, and sometimes even the alpha female, will terminate the cubs or the babies that were birthed by a competing male or in some other way that threatens the primacy of the dominant creature in the herd. And of course, we even feel heartbroken when we've seen documentaries that demonstrate those kinds of things. Part of the human struggle is to transcend those instinctive animal instincts that are inside of us, that are woven into our bodies. And yet, as Jung and Freud demonstrated, we are never fully free of that instinctive imperative to both survive and for our existing offspring to survive at all costs. So I can understand the tension and the universality and archetypal level at which those harsh, natural facts have to be held and navigated and negotiated with.
I want to come at this from a slightly different perspective because, Edinger in his book, Ego and Archetype, talks about the significance of the individual. And it seems to me, and this is something that Jung talked about as well, it seems to me that there is an archetypal idea underlying this very basic belief that each individual life is sacred. This is an idea, by the way, that really undergirds our society. It undergirds, it's in the language of the Declaration of Independence, and it's in our Constitution. It's really kind of legal bedrock. And it's not just in the United States. This is an idea that is embedded in world religions. The idea that the individual life matters. So Edinger talks about the all-encompassing mystery of individuality. And this obviously puts us right in this thorny territory of, so what is an individual? Is a fetus an individual, and at what point? It also gets us right into this territory of the archetype of the child. And Jung has a whole beautiful essay in the Collected Works on the archetype of the child. He talks about how the child is both a symbol of future potential and also it's insignificant. It is exposed in mythology. The divine child is often experiences exposure, abandonment, danger, etc. And that these archetypal stories show how precarious is the psychic possibility of wholeness that the child is an image of. So I think this is important, and I wanted to bring it forward because, again, in this realm that we're in of this insoluble dilemma, there isn't really a clear answer. There's value on both sides. And the notion of the sacredness of the child is a deeply embedded psychological fact.
I like that you brought up what a foundational bedrock the valuing of the individual is, and that the movement as a public movement to preserve the life of the unborn way predates Roe versus Wade, and really rose to the public life of our country around World War II and thereafter. And the people that were promulgating this were concerned with the same kinds of issues about human rights that the country was founded on, that inspired the struggle for freedom for African Americans, that inspired the feminist movement, that inspired the movement for gay rights, of that this respect for human life. And so in a way, it's connected with very much what we consider a liberal movement. And also aid to the poor, government aid to the poor was a big part of it. That there is a substrata here, not very far below the surface, about how important it is to defend defenseless minorities.
So running underneath that historic position and in the conflict that's happening right now in the United States is the distinction between life and consciousness. Nobody would argue that a fertilized ovum is alive. Cellular mitosis begins. but cellular mitosis is happening all over your body. Every cell in the human body is dividing, which is why we continue to be alive. So the tension in the conversation is, why are the cells that are of the ovum, the fertilized ovum, why are those held in precious regard versus other kind of cellular activity? And it's because of course, the fertilized ovum evokes the archetype of the child, just as you said, Lisa, that as soon as the archetype descends, it takes something that could be ordinary as many of the cells in your body, and it imbues it with an archetypal potential, a feeling, imagery, archetypal behaviors that are stirred around it. But it is the archetype that provides the level of meaning, the inescapable meaning of a particular event. And so we sit with that. The conversation often around abortion has to do with life and consciousness, and the struggle to define consciousness, and when the fetal cells display consciousness is something that is very fraught and very potent.
I don't know that it's consciousness. I guess it depends. It's more like sentience, you know? I mean, consciousness as we talk about it, about sort of differentiated from the unconscious. But it's sort of like, when do we imagine that mysterious spark of life descends into it? I mean, this is for science. This is for someone versed in metaphysics. I mean, how do we make that decision?
Which is why this is such a powerful and difficult topic. Absolutely.
But in a way, I wonder if framing it as if, in quotes, we could ever agree, anyone, on when sentience takes place. When does life take place? Is there a soul? Framing it this way means that we will never, ever agree.
Right.
Whether life begins at conception or 3 weeks later, 6 weeks later.
Or when the kids leave for college.
So I think what I'm really wanting to call up here is that we tend to frame things in ways that automatically go into the polarities, which, because it's infused with these archetypal and instinctual forces, the realities of human nature, then become heated, and then we're off to the races with no way to discuss or come to an agreement or activate the transcendent function.
That's right. And then so we're in this realm of this where we're talking about how we talk about it, which is one of my personal real concerns, is that can we talk about it? Because the thing is that when we're in a split, when we're stuck in a split, there is no room for ambivalence. So if you're really stuck in a split, then you think that your way is 100% right and the other way is 100% wrong. There's no nuance. There's no room for complicated feelings about things. It's just that they're wrong and you're right. And when we're in that place, there's no movement. So because this is the way my pathetic intellect works, I have a Dr. Seuss story for this, which is it's a little story. I can't remember the title of it, but there's a north going Zax and a south going Zax. And as you might suspect, at one point they're on the road together, and the north going Zax is going north and the south going Zax is going south, and they meet each other, and neither one will step aside for the other. And so in wonderful Seussian style, they just stand there in the middle of the page while an entire city gets erected around them. And there is no movement. And somehow my fervent wish is that we could find a way to confront these very painful differences, and yet somehow be able to be in relationship with each other such that we might move beyond the stuck place.
What I think about what you just said, which is so vivid, especially the Dr. Seuss illustration, is how can we be in relationship with one another? How can we talk about this? How can we disagree without demonizing the other side? We are people who care very much about this and other issues. How do we avoid these heated polarities that get us stuck like those two Zaxes, and remember that we're people and that we care? And imagine if one of those Zaxes had said to the other, tell me about yourself. Tell me, why is it so important for you to be traveling south? And the other person replied, and will you tell me what is so important about traveling north? If we could start to reach out and take an interest and hear, experience, it would make a difference, which takes me to how important it is that we talk about this, because it is a public issue about a very private experience. This is a topic where some enormous number of women in this country have had abortions, depending on, whatever polls you imagine, but it is from 1 to 3 women in America may have had abortions. And we keep it secret, we keep it private, we don't talk about it, and then it becomes polarized as a sort of moral right, wrong, pro and con, for and against issue in the public domain. And we need to descend to the personal realm of experience and caring. And caring.
And I think that, Deb, always moves us from power and control towards eros and empathy, because that actually is what's at crisis right now. I mean, as human beings, we have disparate philosophies on everything under the sun. Somebody believes or prioritizes one thing over another, sometimes with such intensity that they might fight to the death around what they believe in.
Mm-hmm.
But this issue of wanting to control other people to obey what I believe is correct.
Yeah.
Is something that's easier to do if you have no empathy or capacity for empathy of the other. Then power becomes its own self-reinforcing circle. And I think what you're saying, Deb, is that that self-reinforcing circle could be penetrated by these specific empathic experiences
of regular, ordinary people, not the extreme, emotionally laden examples that are often kind of promulgated out there. But I also want to take this into how your idea of power and control, which is then veers right into the sort of moral right, wrong place of what's right and what's wrong, what's good, what's bad. And we know in the consulting room over and over again that when things get framed as right or wrong, should and shouldn't, can't or won't, that there has been a distancing from human feeling, from the felt personal experience, the inner conflict, the ambiguities and ambivalencies of emotionally laden issues. And going into the right, wrong moral argument really allows us to escape how difficult it is to be empathic and to have eros and to have care rather than moralizing about it.
I'm going to lean into something here, which feels huge, and we haven't talked about it yet. But that is the way that this topic is a women's issue, and so it's a women's issue, and it, is it about men trying to control women? That is one aspect of it for sure. And then there is, and how does this relate to the feminine as a psychological principle that both men and women are capable of being in relationship with? And I want to share this quote from Marion Woodman that maybe helps us move into this a little bit. Patriarchs, men and women, who have no concept of conscious femininity, so a patriarch could be a man or a woman, are locked in an energy that blinds their eyes and deafens their ears to their own unconscious rage. They believe they have feminine feeling, but their blind devotion to Great Mother in whatever form, state, church, corporation, university, has cut off their connection to their own soul values. This lack of soul connection results in unconscious projections that can be diabolic in their intensity. Anger quickly seethes into rage, distrust into contempt. Individuals whose egos are battered and bewildered by the chaos of collapsing structures can quickly succumb to possession by unconscious forces. While I still have faith in divine purpose, I am increasingly sobered by the depths of unconsciousness to be overcome and the kind of inner strength necessary to prevail.
Lisa, I really appreciate Marion Woodman's quote and the depth of insight that's folded into her progression of ideas. She really brings Jung's thoughts to life, making them accessible. One of the things that she brings forward is that the idea of the patriarchy is a system of thought and belief and is fundamentally archetypal. We could say that the patriarchy is something that prioritizes logos, or the primacy of thought and concept and the orderliness, the Apollonic orderliness of thought. And in that regard, it makes sense that it would prioritize potential, because much of the potential we discover in ourselves is discovered by the mind. Zeus's mind was pregnant with Athena, and Athena sprung right out of his head without any kind of a feminine vehicle. So in that patriarchal structure, again, I think that abstract idea of what the fetus could be and is in one's mind feels very radiant, very potent, and very real. And just as a demonstration of how this idea is distributed with some statistical balance between men and women, that in the recent Gallup poll, 47% of men describe themselves as pro-life and 33% of women describe themselves as pro-life, and that's only a 14% difference. So it lets us know that logos, the masculine consciousness, can be equally appealing to males and females. The thing that we're exploring in our conversation, because that's not right or wrong, it's phenomenologic, is the idea that the matriarchal ideas, or the matriarchy, is archetypally connected with eros and a primacy of feeling. So when we look at the feeling that is extended to the woman who has an unwanted pregnancy, and that her experience and our ability to connect to her experience doesn't come from abstract thinking. It comes from the heart. It comes from the body. It comes from listening rather than speaking. And so I hear this tension between those systems of belief.
I am thinking about, in this context, systems of belief and how they can be infused with the religious instinct. And it is an instinct, according to Jung. Not only is the religious instinct inbuilt, but it's one of only 5 instincts that Jung identified, along with hunger, sex, activity, our need to move around, and creativity. So it really underlines how important belief systems are and the kind of energy they're infused with. And I think these archetypal realities of eros and logos, the feminine principle, the masculine principle, matriarchy and patriarchy, really are highly charged when they attach themselves to a cultural issue. Wow, we're really in the heat of the moment. And then you mentioned the word phenomenological, which just means, what are the phenomena? What do we see? What do we hear? What do we experience bodily? And Jung, of course, was a phenomenologist par excellence, which I think puts your statistic about the 47% of men and 33% of women who are pro-life in a phenomenological context that could really help us here. In other words, what are the facts? So I'll add another fact that is part of the phenomenology of this, which is 60% of people believe that abortion should be legal in the first trimester. 34% do not believe that it should be. Different polls have different statistics, but they're all within a few points of this kind of divide. And that takes me back to your thing about belief systems, that given this cultural kind of phenomena, the decision about Roe v. Wade and the primacy and the hold that, in my view, belief systems can take is all the more interesting and noteworthy.
So we could imagine that what's happening in our culture right now is a war between gods.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah.
That's really great.
Whether we think of it as, the great mother and the great father, perhaps, in as much as we have logos and eros, and that either they claim certain people in the culture for reasons that we can't possibly explain, or people gravitate because they recognize a resonance with a particular way of thinking and being. But it does create this kind of polarity, as you were saying. And the difficulty around archetypes is that they are, in many ways, not dimensional, that there's something overly concrete about the archetypes. And we see this in the mythology around the gods. You can kind of predict what Zeus is going to do just by reading his myths. And it doesn't seem to deviate very far, from the things we hear over and again. Hera doesn't seem to deviate. You can kind of predict, how she's going to
very broad
go.
Emotional repertoire.
Exactly.
Yes, exactly.
So when we get possessed by an archetype, we get small and hot, and we start losing, just as you said, the subtlety. We start losing, in some ways, our humanity, the complexity of being human can fall away.
And that's what happens when you get identified with a god. So I really like, Joseph, that we've sort of landed that this is the battle between gods. It's like that old, terrible movie, The Clash of the Titans or something like that.
Right.
And if we fall in with one god or the other, it's dangerous to get to identified with an archetype.
And it's dangerous on both sides.
That's right.
Being identified with the Sky Father or the Earth Mother, or being over-identified with any archetype, addles us. It makes it very difficult for us to sort out and to be creative. It also collapses, Deb, what you were talking about, the tension of the opposites, that the transcendent function may not activate because we're cordoned off in this predictable area of the archetype.
Just to reiterate, what the transcendent function is, the hope in an individual and in a collective is that if the polarities can really have at it with one another, but in a productive and dialogic, back and forth kind of way, without getting solidified into these archetypal polarities, then the possibility arises of a third thing, something that we wouldn't have simply been able to think through, or we would have done that already. Something new, something that is born of the tension of the opposites, but is neither one of them. And wouldn't that be great if we could do that in our national collective on a number of issues, including, of course, abortion?
It would be great.
Before we switch to a dream, I'd just like to say that a number of the references and the data that I've provided are going to be in the show notes, which will give credit where credit is due to some of the facts that I put out there.
Did you know your dreams reveal the wisdom of your guiding self? Dreams connect us to the secret world within and remind us that we're never alone. We're always accompanied by our inner companion who offers healing, balance, insight, and guidance as we make key decisions. At 28, Charles felt lost and isolated. He had a dream that touched him deeply. As he worked with the dream in dream school, he understood that it was showing him how he was profoundly connected to life. This powerful insight led him to make real progress with his goals. During Dream School's 12-month transformational program, you'll learn to harness the power of your unconscious wisdom, decode the language of metaphor and symbol, discover mythological motifs that shape your life, reveal unknown facets of your personality, unlock the door to inner wisdom. To enroll, just go to interpretmydream.net and sign up today to gain immediate access to the first 3 Dream School modules. Your best life awaits you at Dream School, and we can't wait to see you there.
Our dreamer today is the 35-year-old male who works as a filmmaker. And he writes, I'm in a dressing room or anteroom getting ready for my wedding. My mother steps in and makes some critical remark to me. I don't remember the exact details, but something along the lines of, you're never ready on time, or you always leave things for the last minute. Then she exits, leaving me alone with my father. We are getting ready for the wedding. I ask him what all the guests are going to do while they're waiting for us, and he reassures me that the rabbi of my synagogue will keep everyone entertained while we get ready. I then hear the rabbi leading all the guests in Jewish songs from outside. Back in the dressing room, my father and I are putting on tuxedos. I take out a box of studs for the tuxedo shirt and lay them across some kind of table with a soft surface. The golden studs are spread out across the surface, and I begin to sift through them, but I'm unable to distinguish which studs belong to me and which belong to my father. They look identical. I examine them in the palm of my hand and grow frustrated, being unable to pick out which one is which. Then I realize that I am not clean-shaven. I have the same stubble that I currently have in my waking life, and grow even more frustrated, feeling a sense that my parents never leave me enough time to get the things done that I need to get done. Then I wake up and ask myself, why am I blaming my parents for my own time management problems? As context, he writes, I married my wife 3 years ago, and I didn't wear a tux at the wedding. She converted to Judaism, but the entire process, including getting my parents to accept our relationship, was a deeply painful and difficult process. My wife and I recently moved to a new neighborhood, which is not in the Orthodox Jewish part of town, and in some way it felt like the end of a chapter in our conversion or Judaism saga with my parents, which is when I had this dream. The main feelings in the dream were anger, frustration, disappointment, and exasperation. And then he adds a little bit more personal note. The rabbi in the dream was the rabbi of my synagogue for my entire childhood and teenage years. He remained extremely close with my parents, my father in particular, until recently, and helped coach my mother through accepting my wife's conversion and our relationship together. He and his wife and children frequently appear in my dreams, though I can't give a thorough explanation. I suspect this rabbi has played a part in helping my father manage or control his relationship with my mother. So if we just start at the beginning, and there's a pending wedding, and boy, Jung really was stimulated by wedding symbolism. That meant a lot to him. It shows up a lot in archetypal work and in alchemy and mythology, that the wedding or the coming together of two things to become a new amalgam was compelling to Jung. And so the idea that that's been invoked is significant.
You're right, Joseph. There's so much about a wedding symbolically. There's so much. It's a union. It's the conjunctio. It's the coming together. It's the integration of the opposites. But it also means a choosing. There's the tarot card of the lovers was sometimes known as just the choice, because to make a commitment to someone means to, forsake all others. And when we get married, there is something very deep that gets activated where we are choosing a certain life. And yes, we're forsaking other partners, presumably, but we're also really separating psychologically from our parents much of the time.
I went immediately, and I think you guys, your comments are there too, into family systems. And the male-female dynamics in the dream. We have the dreamer or the dream ego, his wedding, and then we have some opposition in real life from the dreamer's mother, and in the dream mother says, "You're never ready on time." She makes the critical remark. The alliance with the father, and then the mix-up with the studs. And I can't help but hear a little bit of a pun in the word stud. But the masculine alignment of the father there in the dream with him, the father trying to ameliorate the relationship with his wife, the mother-in-law, the rabbi, who's almost always a male. They say in family systems therapy that there are always 6 people in the room. There's the couple, and then there is one person's father and mother, and the other person's father and mother. So I'm just kind of playing with all these various forces that are active in this dream.
It seems to me that the little fantasy that I weave about this dreamer and his life is that he was embedded in his family of origin, as all of us are, and that included being embedded in a certain culture and religion, which is true for some of us and less true for others of us. And that his marriage to a woman who converted to Judaism was an opportunity for a psychological separation from his parents. But it's not affected yet. It's still in process, or perhaps it's just finished, because the mother complex is chastising and critical. You're never ready on time. So there's a kind of infantilization going on. I mean, the dreamer's 35 and his inner mother is treating him like he's 8. So his mother complex. And then his father is a positive symbol.
Yes.
But there's this problem that the dreamer can't differentiate what of value belongs to him and what of value belongs to his father. So these studs are golden, so kind of the highest value. So this could be values, attitudes, kind of, ancestral gold, as it were, that's been handed down through the generations in terms of culture, in terms of cultural values. or qualities, even qualities that the dreamer has. Which ones are his and which one are his father's? He can't tell. And then he's inappropriately, kind of hasn't shaven. So there's a sort of, again, that's a little kind of puerile. You didn't clean up, and he gets frustrated with himself, and then has this critical question as he's waking up: why am I blaming my parents for my own time management problems? And we might ask ourselves, as we become psychological adults, which often happens decades after becoming chronological adults, why am I blaming my parents for my problems? And I think it's a lovely dream. I think it's a very significant dream. It's a dream of a man who is really putting his hands on the plow. He's really taking on his own psychological truth and his own psychological life. And I imagine that his marriage to his wife and the move out of the Orthodox Jewish part of town are part of that discernment process of what's mine and what belongs to my parents. And in this whole scenario, we have the rabbi, who is a wonderful figure, very positive, kind of invokes the archetype of the senex, the wise old man, but also I think of the self. I think the rabbi carries the self, and in that he can unite the opposites, and he can facilitate the integration of these opposing forces, whether it's mother and father, or whether it's the son and his non-Jewish wife, or she wasn't Jewish before, and the parents. The rabbi can facilitate the coming together.
There's a real alliance here amongst the male figures in the dream ego, the rabbi, and the father.
In service to the dream ego's differentiation and individuation.
In service to the dream ego's wedding. The conjunctio, as you said before, the opposite. A woman is not a man, and she was not Jewish, at least not before her wedding. What I'm also interested in here is the dynamic of the feminine in the dream and in the dreamer's life, where the rabbi in waking life, rabbi helped the father, quote, coach his mother through accepting her new daughter-in-law. And in the dream, the mother is critical of the dream ego. So I imagine some of it has to do with coming into his own as an adult male in the dream that's imaged by him not being ready on time, not being able to sort out the studs. In other words, his differentiation from his father, having a beard stubble that he didn't shave. But some of it is also coming to terms with the feminine, and it's telling that he and his wife moved out of the Jewish Orthodox neighborhood in waking life just recently. The critical or conflictual dynamic is with the feminine.
Everything you guys have said makes good sense, and I really agree with it. I found the moment with the gold studs to be particularly energized. And it's this place where he really slows down, has to really concentrate to figure out what's mine versus what's my father's. And it's a difficult discernment. I mean, it's very hard for him to do. But what a wonderful way to think about the analytic process. And we really do have to really meticulously pick through the values, ideas, behaviors that we inherited and asking ourselves whether this belongs to me. So I thought that image was really great. I did think it was interesting that as he's struggling to differentiate from his father, he becomes aware of his beard, which is an explicitly masculine manifestation, a secondary sexual characteristic. And
says Joseph as he strokes his beard.
There you go. And this feeling that the beard has to go, that it has to be shaved off. But I had myself thinking, does it have to be shaved off? Do we have to be clean faced, which in a sense harkens back to a younger time? Or is the stubble, which I think is often a roughness, an unrefinedness about him, is there room for that? Not sure. The ego thinks, this is something that has to be cleaned up, but it's a choice there that one should consider. In the end, when he's talking about his parents never leaving him enough time to get the things done that he needs to get done, and then he questions who he's blaming for it. What I was imagining there is, again, this dawning awareness of the parental complexes, that they do act in him. And I think, like the mother complex, they have this kind of, finger snapping, come on, quality to them, which gives this sense, perhaps an artificial sense of urgency that may not be warranted. And he's questioning that as one of the separations in the tuxedo studs. This urgency around time, this anxiety about planning and getting things done in a particular way. Is that really him? Or is that just a kind of an inherited anxiety from the parental complexes? When I think about him as a filmmaker, as a creative type, there are times in the creative process where things cannot be hurried. They cannot happen on a schedule. That there's this daimon, there is an inner intelligence that's doing things on its own schedule, as compared to when the filming starts. Once the filming starts, every second is accounted for, and efficiency and getting things on time is very, very important. And in terms of managing budget and other factors. So there's a place for some of the parental values. There's a place where maybe it's being invasive. And I loved what you guys said about the rabbi. The rabbi is the one who holds the groom and the bride and welcomes them into this new life.
Yeah.
And so the fact that the rabbi has come forward as, just as you said, as the self that facilitates the amalgam of the relationship, as I think a sign of the transcendent function.
Yeah. Yep.
The parental complexes couldn't get that done.
No.
But the internal rabbi can.
Yes, it's great.
Yeah. I also like the rabbi as a figure of joy. Because all this is so heavy. But the rabbi will keep everyone entertained, not praying or silent, but just entertained. And he is leading all the guests in Jewish songs.
Yeah, that's lovely. You're right. That's really lovely.
So part of me says, isn't part of the message of this dream to lighten up, enjoy? In Jewish services, there's often a cantor as well, which is unique to Judaism. And the cantor leads people in song and generates a feeling of joy. So people are really participating in the singing and that feeling of life, which, as you've mentioned already, I think is happening, that process of discernment that is indicated by our dreamer having moved out of one neighborhood and into another.
I like you bringing that up, Deb, also, because the rabbi taking care of the congregation lets the ego know that it's okay that he's moving on his own schedule, that the congregants can handle themselves, that this isn't a disaster, even though the mother complex is, very concerned and anxious. But the rabbi is really demonstrating, like, it's okay, we'll all handle ourselves, we're having a good time. Come when you're ready.
James Hollis writes about one of the tasks of midlife is to develop a mature spirituality, not that just kind of handed to you by your parents. And it does require this process of discernment. We go back and we sift through that which was given to us by the Father, it culturally even. And we say, yes, this is still alive for me. I want to keep this part of it. This speaks to me. But this value, maybe this doesn't matter to me. there's a real conscious stance toward the religion, the dogma, the values that are transmitted culturally, and that is part of our individuation job. And it seems to me that this dreamer is in the process very much of doing that. It seems like, I'm guessing here, but it seems like Judaism is possibly still quite important to him, but they've moved out of the Orthodox part of town. And so he has a new stance, perhaps, toward his religion.
Mm-hmm.
You've been listening to This Jungian Life. From our website, thisjungianlife.com, you can follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, help us produce future episodes by funding us through Patreon, and submit your dreams for possible interpretation on another episode. We'd like to thank our listener who shared a dream for today's show and hope you'll let us know what topics you'd enjoy hearing more about. Until next time, keep living this Jungian life.